On the night of June 9, 1994, inside a modest home on Shrewsbury Road in Mary Esther, Florida, a technical sergeant in the United States Air Force did something that defied every oath he had ever taken. By the time the sun rose over Eglin Air Force Base the next morning, 34-year-old Sylvia Zakvski and her two young children, Kim and Anna, were dead. Today, we are opening the criminal file on Edward Zakrzewski. This is not just a story about a murder, it is a 31-year odyssey through the darkest corners of the human mind and the most complex gears of the American justice system. We will trace his early life, his rise through the military, the chilling premeditation phase, where he bought the tools of death on his lunch break, and finally, his 2025 execution, where he used his last breath to mock the state that was putting him to death. Before we break the seal on the forensic evidence, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and also click on the subscription button so that you don't miss our next video. Welcome to Criminal Files. Edward James Zakvski II was born on January 31, 1965. If you look at his childhood in Kalamazoo, Michigan, you find a void where monsters usually grow. There were no reports of animal cruelty, no broken home, no history of early childhood trauma that forensic psychologists usually look for. He was a child of the Midwest, raised with a sense of order. When he joined the Air Force, that order became his religion. To understand why this case is so disturbing, you have to understand the rank of technical sergeant. In the Air Force, a tech sergeant is a craftsman. They are the backbone of the squadron. They don't just follow orders, they manage people, they solve technical problems, and they are expected to exhibit proven leadership. Zakvski wasn't just a soldier, he was a supervisor. He was trained to be calm under pressure. He was trained to plan. He was trained to be efficient. By June of 1994, Zakvski was 29 years old. He was just 1 year away from his college degree. On paper, he was the perfect citizen, but the criminal file reveals that this discipline was a double-edged sword. The same traits that made him a great sergeant made him a terrifyingly effective killer. He didn't kill Sylvia because he lost it. He killed her because he had approached the problem of his divorce with the same cold, technical mindset he used to fix an aircraft engine. The most tragic part of this file is that it could have been closed before it ever began. A neighbor, whose identity remained a point of focus throughout the trial, later admitted to a terrifying secret. On at least 2 separate occasions in the months leading up to June 1994, Edward Zakvski had stood in his yard, looked at his neighbor, and said, "I will kill them all before I let her take them away from me." Why didn't the neighbor call the police? Why didn't he call Eglin Air Force Base? The answer is the uniform. The neighbor saw a technical sergeant. He saw a man of discipline. He assumed it was just guy talk, a man venting about a messy marriage. But while the neighbor was dismissing the threats, Zakvski was beginning the financial severance phase. On June 8, 1994, the night before the massacre, Zakvski didn't sleep. He went to a local ATM and a bank branch. He withdrew $5,400. This is a critical detail in the criminal file, because it completely dismantles the crime of passion defense. You don't withdraw your life savings the night before a spontaneous argument. You withdraw that money because you have already decided that by the next morning you will be a fugitive. This is perhaps the most chilling 60 minutes in the history of Florida crime. At 11:30 a.m., Edward Zakvski clocked out for lunch. Most of his fellow airmen went to the chow hall, or a local deli. Zakvski drove to an Army surplus store. He walked through the aisles with the same professional focus he used on the base. He selected a machete. He paid for it in cash. He then drove 40 miles back to Shrewsbury Road. He didn't go inside to eat. He went to his garage. He took out a whetstone, and he sharpened the blade of that machete until it was razor thin. He then walked into the master bedroom. He placed a crowbar under the bed. He took a length of industrial rope and cut it to a specific size. He placed the rope near the crowbar. Then he did something unthinkable. He went back to work. He drove back to Eglin Air Force Base. He finished his shift. He supervised his subordinates. He filled out paperwork. He was the perfect soldier for another 4 hours, knowing that his tools were waiting for him back at the house. When he arrived home that evening, he didn't wait for a conversation. Sylvia Zakvski was 34 years old. She was a woman who had spent years trying to bridge the gap between her South Korean heritage and her American life. She was a mother who wanted a better life for her children. The assault began in the living room. There was no screaming match heard by neighbors. Zakrzewski used the crowbar first. The force was so significant that Sylvia was incapacitated almost immediately. He then dragged her into the bedroom, the same room where he had staged the rope. The forensic record compiled by medical examiner Dr. Edward Harvard shows a level of cruelty that is hard to process. Sylvia wasn't dead when the rope was used. She was strangled while already suffering from a fractured skull. But the criminal file gets darker. He didn't stop with Sylvia. He called his 7-year-old son, Kim, and his 5-year-old daughter, Anna, into the bathroom. He told them to brush their teeth. It was a ruse to get them into a confined space where they couldn't run. The bloodstain analyst, Jan Johnson, testified that Anna was kneeling over the edge of the bathtub when she was struck. The most heartbreaking detail? Anna had defensive wounds on her hands. She had seen what happened to her brother. She had raised her small arms to protect herself from her own father. Zakrzewski then placed all 3 bodies in the bathtub, washed himself clean in the sink, changed into a fresh uniform, and left the house. For the next 72 hours, the house on Shrewsbury Road was a tomb. Neighbors noticed the blue 1992 geoprism was gone, but they assumed the family had finally taken that vacation they talked about. Meanwhile, Zakrzewski was at Orlando International Airport. He used the $5,400 to buy a ticket to the one place he thought he could disappear, Hawaii. He chose Hawaii because he had no ties there, no family, no military history. He was a complete stranger. He moved to the island of Molokai and took on the name Michael Ray Green. He found a religious commune run by a local pastor. For 4 months, the technical sergeant became a humble handyman. He was Brother Mike. He fixed the plumbing. He helped with the harvest. He sat in the front row of the church every Sunday. The pastor later said that Mike was the most disciplined, hard-working man he had ever met. He didn't know he was harboring a man who had left a blood-soaked bathtub 4,000 miles away. The end of his run came not from a police raid, but from a television screen. On October 14, 1994, the commune was gathered around the TV watching Unsolved Mysteries. A photo of Edward Zakrzewski flashed on the screen. The room went silent. The pastor looked at Brother Mike. The resemblance was perfect. Zakrzewski didn't wait to be arrested. He wrote a note, "I'm sorry," and walked into the local police station. The 4-month hunt was over. The 31-year legal battle was about to begin. When Edward Zakrzewski was flown back from Hawaii to Florida, he wasn't the technical sergeant anymore. He was a man stripped of his stripes, his future, and his pride. But he was still a strategist. The criminal file from his early days in the Okaloosa County Jail reveals a man who refused to admit defeat. In August 1995, while awaiting trial for 3 counts of first-degree murder, Zakrzewski proved he was still a flight risk. He and another inmate were caught at the perimeter fence, attempting to scale the razor wire. It was a desperate move that signaled to the prosecution exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. He wasn't remorseful. He was looking for a way out. On March 19, 1996, Edward Zakrzewski did something that shocked the community. He pleaded guilty to all 3 counts. It seemed like an admission of guilt, but it was actually a tactical move for the penalty phase. By pleading guilty, he avoided a long trial where the graphic photos of Sylvia, Kim, and Anna would be shown to a jury for weeks. He wanted to skip straight to the argument for his life. The defense, led by Isaac Curran and Elton Killam, presented a narrative that the criminal file records as one of the most controversial in Florida history. They didn't deny he killed them. They argued he did it out of mercy. They painted a picture of a man who was terrified of what would happen to his mixed-race children in South Korea. Attorney Killam used words in open court that would never be tolerated today, calling the children half-breeds and claiming Zakrzewski feared they would be outcasts in Sylvia's homeland. They alleged Sylvia was a gambler and unfaithful. They tried to turn the victim into the villain. But prosecutor Bobby Elmore had the forensic ledger. He didn't focus on the marriage, he focused on the machete. He stood before the jury and held up the bank receipt from the night before the murders. He asked the jury a simple question. Does a man who is acting out of mercy for his children empty his bank account 12 hours before he kills them? When the jury went back to deliberate, the criminal file hit its most complex snag. They weren't unanimous. For the murder of Sylvia and 7-year-old Kim, the vote was 7-5 in favor of death. For the murder of 5-year-old Anna, the vote was a 6-6 dead heat. Under current Florida law, Edward Zakrzewski would have walked out of that courtroom with a life sentence. Today, you need a minimum of 8 votes for death. But in 1996, the rules were different. Judge G. Robert Barron sat on the bench and looked at the technical sergeant. He saw the cold calculation. He saw the sharpened blade. He exercised his power of judicial override. He ignored the deadlock and sentenced Edward Zakrzewski to death on all 3 counts. The criminal file then enters a 3-decade-long stalemate. From 1996 to 2025, Zakrzewski lived in a 6-by-9-foot cell. He didn't spend that time in prayer or reflection. He spent it in the law library. He became an expert on his own case. He watched as the laws in Florida changed around him. He watched as the Supreme Court ruled that judicial overrides were unconstitutional. He thought he had found his loophole. He argued that since the judge overrode the jury in 1996, his sentence should be commuted to life. But the courts were cold. They ruled that because his case was finalized before the law changed, the new rules didn't apply to him. He was a man trapped in a time capsule of 1996 justice. Every appeal, 1998, 1999, 2003, 2006, 2009, 2018, was a door slamming shut. The end began on July 1st, 2025. Governor Ron DeSantis signed the warrant. The criminal file was now on a 30-day countdown. In those final 30 days, the Action Network and Floridians for Alternatives to the Death Penalty launched a massive campaign to save him. They argued that executing a man whom a jury couldn't agree on was a stain on the state. But the victims' voices, though silent for 31 years, were louder. The brutal details of the bathtub on Shrewsbury Road were re-released to the public. The sympathy evaporated. July 31st, 2025. The final 24 hours, Zakrzewski is awakened. He is given a physical exam to ensure he is healthy enough to be executed. 10 a.m., His final meal is prepared. It is a staggering amount of food, a soldier's final rations. 4 fried pork chops, a mountain of fried onions and potatoes, crispy bacon and thick buttered toast, a pint of vanilla ice cream, and a whole apple pie. 2 cans of root beer and a pot of black coffee. He ate almost all of it. He didn't request a priest. He didn't call any family. He sat in silence, waiting for the clock to hit 6 p.m. At 6:02 p.m., Edward Zakrzewski was led into the chamber at Florida State Prison. He was strapped down with heavy leather belts. Through the glass, he could see the witnesses. Among them was Detective Joe Nelson. Nelson had been a young investigator in 1994. He was the one who found the children. He had carried the photos of that crime scene in his briefcase for 31 years. He had never attended an execution in his career, but he told the press, "I had to see this one through. I owed it to Anna." When the warden asked for his final words, Zakrzewski didn't look at Nelson. He looked at the ceiling. He began to recite Robert Frost. "The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep." He stopped mid-sentence. He turned his head slightly toward the microphone and delivered his final sarcastic jab at the people of Florida. He thanked them for killing him in such a humane way. He was a sergeant to the very end, disciplined, cold, and refusing to give the state the satisfaction of an apology. 6:12 p.m. The line went flat. Click on subscribe button for more videos.